A man stood alone in the darkness facing 5 riders with torches. They came to destroy everything he'd built, the dam that could save his dying cattle, his land, his last hope. He had no gun, no weapon, only his words. And in that moment, Ethan Cooper had to make a choice: fight and die or find another way. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from right now. I read every single one. But to understand how a broken cavalry scout ended up here, we need to go back 4 weeks earlier, to a train station at the edge of nowhere, to a woman sitting alone on a wooden trunk abandoned by the man who ordered her like furniture from a catalog. This is the story of Ethan Cooper and Claire Hartford. This is how the West was really won. Texas, August 1887, midnight. The moon hangs low over the parched earth, casting silver light across a half-built dam. Water just inches deep glimmers in the basin like a promise waiting to be kept. The air smells of dust and desperation, of a land dying one breath at a time. 5 men on horseback circle the dam, torches blazing in their hands. The flames dance and twist, throwing grotesque shadows across the cracked ground. At the center of this ring of fire stands a man, tall and weathered, his hand resting easy on the Colt Navy revolver at his hip. Ethan Cooper, 38 years old, former cavalry scout, widower, survivor. Across from him, Wade Bishop sits astride a black stallion, a six-shooter pointed at Ethan's chest. The scar running down Wade's left cheek catches the torchlight, a white line of violence from a knife fight years past. His eyes are hard but uncertain, the eyes of a man following orders he doesn't fully believe in. Behind Wade, 4 more riders shift in their saddles. Young men, ranch hands, men who need the $50 Clayton Hargrove promised them more than they need to be right. The wind picks up, carrying the scent of sage and the faint promise of rain that may never come. Then hoofbeats, fast and furious, cutting through the tension like a blade. A rider appears from the darkness. Winchester rifle cradled across the saddle. Claire Hartford, 32 years old. Mail-order bride that nobody wanted, hair wild from the right eyes, fierce with a determination that surprises even herself. She pulls her horse alongside Ethan, the rifle now pointed at Wade, with the steady hands of someone who has learned not to hesitate. Wade's gun wavers. His men look at each other, questions forming in the silence. Ethan's voice cuts through the night, low and cold as winter steel. 5 of you. 2 of us. I've seen worse odds. The moment stretches, torches crackle, horses stamp and snort. 6 guns against 2, but something in Ethan Cooper's eyes speaks of Apache war parties and desperate last stands of a man who has walked through fire and found it wanting. Wade Bishop's finger trembles on the trigger, and in that trembling lies the seed of doubt that will change everything. But before we understand how these 2 broken souls came to stand together against the night before, we can know why a cavalry scout and a forgotten woman would risk everything for a hole in the ground that might never hold water. We must go back 4 weeks earlier, to a train station at the edge of nowhere, to the moment when 2 people who had lost everything discovered they still had something left to lose. To the beginning. The morning sun had not yet burned away the cool of the Texas night when Ethan Cooper rode into Red Creek Station. The wooden platform stretched before him, weathered gray by wind and time paint peeling in long strips like the skin of something ancient and dying. The smell of coal smoke hung thick in the still air, mixing with the sharper scent of axle grease, baking on iron rails that stretched east and west toward horizons he no longer cared to see. His wagon needed attention. The left rear wheel had developed a wobble on the ride, in the kind of small problem that becomes a catastrophe if ignored. Ethan had learned long ago that survival lives in the details, in the things most men overlook until it's too late. He climbed down from the driver's seat, his boots hitting the dust with a soft thud. His body moved with the economy of motion that marks men who have spent years in the saddle. No wasted movement, every gesture purposeful. At 38, he was still strong, his shoulders broad from years of hard work. But there was a weariness in his eyes that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. The wheel came off easier than expected. Ethan laid it flat, examining the worn hub with the practiced eye of a man who had learned to fix things or do without. The bearing needed grease, and the wooden spokes wanted tightening. He pulled his knife from its sheath on his belt, the blade worn smooth from years of use, and began to work. Henry Wolfe appeared in the station office doorway, a silhouette against the dim interior light. 68 years old, bent like mesquite, twisted by decades of relentless wind, but his eyes remained sharp as broken glass. He had been the station master for 40 years, since before the war, and he knew every soul within 50 miles, which is why what he was about to say troubled him. "Cooper, got a minute?" Ethan looked up, reading trouble in the old man's posture. He wiped his hands on his trousers and straightened the wheel, temporarily forgotten. Henry's face carried the particular expression of a man who has witnessed human cruelty and found himself unable to prevent it. "What is it, Henry?" The old station master scratched his chin, where 3 days of white stubble caught the early light. "Come with me. There's something you need to see." They walked the length of the platform, their boots hollow on the warped boards. At the far end, where the overhang created a rectangle of shadow against the glare, a woman sat on a wooden trunk. She faced away from them, looking out at the empty tracks that stretched toward the horizon and vanished into heat shimmer. Claire Hartford, 32 years old, 5 feet and 6 inches of stubborn dignity, wrapped in a faded blue calico dress that had been washed so many times the fabric felt soft as old paper. Her brown hair was pulled back from a face that might have been pretty. Once before hardship drew its lines around her mouth and eyes. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers laced together, knuckles white with the effort of holding herself upright when every instinct screamed to collapse. She had been sitting there since 8 o'clock that morning. 9 hours without moving, without speaking, without acknowledging the few attempts Henry had made to coax her inside where it was cooler, where she might at least sit in a proper chair and drink water that didn't taste of leather and copper. "Who is she?" Ethan asked, though something in his chest already knew the answer would be bad. "Mail order bride," Henry said, and the words carried weight heavy with implication. "Fellow named Joshua Crane was supposed to meet her. You know him. Got that place up past Miller Creek." Ethan knew him, a loud man with soft hands and eyes that never quite met yours, straight, on the kind who smiled too much and meant none of it. The kind who saw people as things to be acquired and discarded based on utility. Did he come for her? "Oh, he came all right." Henry's voice went hard with disgust. Took one look at her, said she weren't what he ordered. Said he'd found himself a younger option. Then he got back on his horse and rode off without so much as a "fare thee well." The words hung in the superheated air like the smell of something burning. Ethan stared at the rigid line of the woman's spine, at the way she held her head up, despite everything, at the terrible dignity of someone who has been reduced to merchandise and found wanting. "She's been sitting there all this time, all day long." Henry's voice dropped lower, heavy with something that might have been shame at his own species. "I offered her water, offered her a chair inside where it's cooler. She just shook her head. Won't talk to nobody. I tell you, Ethan, I ain't seen nothing like it in 40 years. What kind of man does that? Orders a woman like she's furniture from a catalog, then sends her back because she ain't shiny enough." Ethan didn't answer. He was already walking his boots, making hollow sounds on the platform boards. Thunk, 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 each step bringing him closer to a decision he hadn't yet made, but could feel forming in the hollow space where his heart used to be. The woman didn't turn at his approach. Didn't move. He came around the trunk and stopped a few feet in front of her, his shadow falling across her face, blocking the brutal afternoon sun. Her eyes lifted into the sudden shade. Gray eyes, clear as creek water, but there was something in them that made Ethan's chest tighten. Not defeat exactly, not even sadness. More like a wall carefully constructed over years of disappointment that said, "I have been hurt before, and I will not let you see how much this hurts now." They looked at each other for a long moment, two people who had learned not to expect anything good from strangers. "Ma'am?" His voice came out rougher than intended. He cleared his throat. "You need help." Her eyes moved across his face like she was reading a map, searching for the lie, the trap, the hidden cruelty that experience had taught her to expect from men who offered assistance. "I am waiting for the next train." "Next train don't come through till Thursday, I know. That's 4 days, I know." Ethan looked at the trunk beneath her, looked at her empty hands, looked at the endless flat, nothing that surrounded them on all sides. Brown grass, white sky, and not a soul for miles except him and Henry and this woman who had been discarded like spoiled goods. "You got somewhere to go. Family number, friend's number." "Money." She didn't answer, but the faint tightening of her jaw told him everything he needed to know. She had perhaps enough for the train ticket east, if that. Certainly not enough to start over wherever that train might take her. Ethan knew he should walk away. This was not his problem. He had his own troubles waiting at the ranch. Drought killing his cattle 3 and 4 at a time. Debts piling up like stones on a grave. A heart that had stopped feeling anything 3 years ago when they put Margaret and Thomas in the ground, and he had promised himself never to feel again because feeling meant hurting, and he had hurt enough for one lifetime. He should walk away. "My name is Ethan Cooper," he said instead. "I got a ranch about 12 miles north of here. It ain't much, but there's a roof and 3 meals a day." His voice was steady, matter-of-fact, offering employment, not charity, because pride was sometimes all people had left. "I need someone to cook and keep house. The work is honest and the pay is fair." The wall in her eyes flickered just for a moment, hope trying to break through and being beaten back by experience. "I am not looking for charity, Mr. Cooper. Didn't offer you none. I'm offering a job." She studied him with an intensity that would have made most men uncomfortable. Her gaze moved across the lines of his face, the calluses on his hands, the way he held himself, with the particular stillness of men who have learned to be comfortable with violence but choose not to indulge it. "Why?" she asked finally. "You don't know me." Ethan could have said many things, could have told her about the way his house echoed with absence, how the silence had become something physical that pressed against him until he thought he might go mad. Could have said that he saw in her eyes the same hollowness that looked back at him from the mirror each morning. Could have admitted that maybe, just maybe, helping her was a way of proving to himself that he was still human, still capable of something beyond mere survival. Instead, he said, "Can you cook?" Something shifted in her expression. The wall cracked just a little. "Yes," she said quietly. "I can cook." Ethan nodded once, then reached down and picked up one end of her trunk. The leather handle was warm from the sun, worn smooth by years of use. The trunk was heavier than it looked, filled with everything this woman owned in the world, and for just a moment, Ethan felt the weight of that, the terrible mathematics of a life reduced to what could fit in a box. "Then let's go," he said. Claire Hartford stood, her legs stiff from 9 hours of sitting. She looked back once at the empty platform at the station where Joshua Crane had looked at her and found her insufficient at the place where her last hope of a normal life had died in the Texas heat. Then she turned away and followed Ethan Cooper toward a future neither of them could imagine. The wagon lurched over a rut in the road and Claire's shoulder bumped against Ethan's. She pulled away quickly, pressing herself against the far edge of the seat, maintaining the careful distance of strangers who have not yet earned the right to casual touch. Ethan kept his eyes on the road ahead, the reins loose in his hands. The horses plodded forward with the resigned patience of animals who know the way home and see no reason to hurry. Dust rose from their hooves in lazy clouds that hung in the still air before settling on everything: the barley bags, the wooden trunk, the faded blue of Claire's dress. The sun sat heavy on their backs like a hand pressing down. The leather reins had grown slick with sweat in Ethan's palms. Neither of them spoke. Miles of brown grass rolled past the land flat and cracked the earth, split into patterns that looked like the skin of something old and dying. The smell of sage drifted on the hot wind, mixing with the sharper scent of horse sweat and the particular metallic taste that comes before rain that never falls. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals invisible to human eyes, searching for anything still alive down below. "The creek dried up in June," Ethan said, finally, his voice sounding strange after so much silence. "Ain't rained proper since April." Claire nodded but said nothing. Her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the desolate landscape. Ethan pointed toward a cluster of dark shapes in the distance. "Those are my cattle. What's left of them." As they drew closer, the shapes resolved into animals, thin beasts with ribs showing through their hides like the bars of cages. They stood gathered around what should have been water, but was only mud brown and crusted at the edges, shrinking day by day under the relentless sun. The smell hit them as they passed, the sour stink of desperation of creatures waiting to die. "How do you keep them alive?" Claire asked her first voluntary question. "Haul water from the well. 2 miles there, 2 miles back, twice a day." He flicked the reins absently. "Well's going dry too." The words were simple, factual, but they contained within them the mathematics of disaster. No water meant no cattle. No cattle meant no money. No money meant losing the land his father had broken, the house, His own hands had built the graves he tended every Sunday evening when the light turned gold and the wind died to nothing. The wagon crested a low rise and the ranch house came into view. Claire's eyes moved across it, taking measure, and Ethan could see it through her eyes. Smaller than expected. The weathered boards gone silver with age. The sagging porch. The windmill standing motionless against the sky, its blades still as death. A barn listing slightly to one side. A chicken coop. A clothesline with nothing on it. And on the porch, two rocking chairs. One large, one small. Both empty. Both waiting for people who would never return. Her gaze lingered there on those two chairs, and Ethan felt something twist in his chest. He had forgotten they were visible from the road, forgotten that other people might see them and understand what they meant. Mr. Cooper, Claire said quietly, carefully, "How long have you lived here alone?" His hands tightened on the reins. The question sat between them like a stone too heavy to lift. 3 years, he said. His voice came out flat, empty. 3 years, 2 months, 11 days. The windmill chose that moment to groan a single long creak of metal on metal that sounded almost human. Then silence rushed back in heavier than before. The kitchen smelled of dust and old grease and something else, something faint and sheer like a room that had forgotten what it was for. Claire stood in the doorway, her trunk still sitting on the porch where Ethan had left it, promising he'd bring it to her room after he checked on the windmill. He had mumbled something about a stall of gear and disappeared around the side of the house, leaving her alone in this space that had once been the heart of a home. She stepped inside. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling beams in long, dusty strands. The cast-iron stove squatted against the far wall, cold and dark, its surface filmed with a layer of grime that spoke of months without use. On the wooden counter, a coffee pot sat beside a hand-crank grinder, both coated in the same fine dust that covered everything. A row of wooden spoons hung from pegs on the wall, untouched. Their handles darkened with age and the ghost of vanished hands that had once used them daily. Claire ran her finger along the edge of the table, drew a line through the dust, looked at the gray on her fingertip. This kitchen had not been used in a long time. Months, maybe longer. She moved to the pantry, pulled open the door. The hinges squealed in protest. Inside, the shelves held the supplies of a man who ate to survive, not to live. Canned beans, their labels faded. Dried corn in a cloth sack. A block of salt pork wrapped in stained fabric, the fat gone yellow. Coffee beans in a dented tin. Flour that had gone hard at the edges. She found matches on a shelf above the stove, kindling in a box beside it. Her hands moved without conscious thought, performing tasks learned so long ago they had become instinct. Crumpling newspaper. Stacking thin sticks of wood. Striking the match, the sulfur smell biting her nose. The flame caught smoke curling up into the flue. The stove began to warm, metal ticking and pinging as it heated. Claire worked the hand pump at the sink. The first few strokes brought nothing but air and a grinding sound that set her teeth on edge. Then water coughed out, rust-colored at first, then clear enough. She filled a pot, set it on the stove to heat. Beans went into a different pot with salt pork and a little molasses she found in the back of the pantry, the jar sticky, the lid crusted shut until she pried it loose with a knife. Cornmeal mixed with water and a pinch of salt, shaped into rounds with her palms pressed flat, laid into a cast-iron skillet she had scrubbed clean with sand and elbow grease. Coffee beans fed into the grinder, the handle turning with arm like bones cracking. The smell rising up dark and bitter and familiar. The smell of morning and purpose and life continuing despite all evidence that it shouldn't. The kitchen filled with warmth, with the smell of food cooking, with something that had been missing from this house for longer than Claire could guess. Steam rose from pots, cornbread crisped in the pan, coffee burbled in its pot, dark and strong. Footsteps on the porch. The screen door opened. Ethan stood in the doorway, his hands black with grease from the windmill repair. His shirt dark with sweat. He looked at the stove, at the steam rising from the pots at her. His face did something strange, a flicker of emotion gone before she could name it. Windmill gear was stuck, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Fixed it. Good. Claire wiped her hands on a cloth she'd found in a drawer. Supper's ready. He washed at the pump outside. She heard the splash of water, the scrubbing of hands, the sound of him clearing his throat. When he came back in, his face was wet, his hair pushed back from his forehead, water dripping onto the collar of his shirt. They sat across from each other at the table. Claire set down the plates. Beans still steaming, the molasses giving them a dark shine. 2 rounds of cornbread, golden brown from the skillet, the edges crisp. She poured coffee into tin cups, the liquid black and strong steam rising in the lamplight. Ethan looked at the food, then at her. His throat worked. I reckon we ought to say grace. Claire folded her hands, bowed her head. Ethan's voice was rough, halting like a man speaking a language he hadn't used in a long time. Lord, we thank you for this food, for the hands that prepared it. He paused, swallowed hard. For your mercies, which we don't always deserve. Amen, amen, Claire whispered. He picked up his fork, looked at the cornbread, his hand stopped. Something moved across his face, quick, almost too fast to see. He stared at the bread like it was something from another life, something he'd thought lost forever. His jaw tightened. The fork trembled just slightly between his fingers. Mr. Cooper. He blinked, but the fork shook again. It's round, he said. His voice was strange, thick with something Claire couldn't identify. I always make it round, she said carefully. My mother taught me that way back when I was just a girl. His eyes closed just for a second. She made it round too. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Claire didn't ask who. She didn't need to. Ethan lifted the fork, cut into the cornbread. The inside was yellow and soft, still warm. He took a bite, chewed slowly. The taste of corn and salt, and the faint sweetness of molasses from the beans. Simple food, honest food. The kind that had graced this table in another lifetime when the house was full of voices. He swallowed. It's good, he said, quietly. Thank you kindly. They ate without speaking after that. The only sounds were the scrape of forks on tin, the creak of the house settling in the cooling air, the distant lowing of cattle somewhere in the dark. The kerosene lamp flickered between them, casting shadows that jumped and swayed on the walls. When the plates were empty, Claire rose to clear them. Ethan stayed seated, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, staring at the wall where a nail stuck out, a nail that had once held something, though she could not guess what. A picture, perhaps, a sampler, something that had mattered to someone. The water situation, she set her back to him as she worked at the sink, the water running cold over her hands. How bad is it? Bad. His voice was flat, stripped of emotion. Wells down to maybe 6 feet. Used to be 20. In the creek, he stopped, started again. They used to swim there in the summers. The word hung in the air like smoke. Claire's hands went still in the soapy water. The creek ran clear back then, Ethan continued, and he didn't seem to realize what he had said, or maybe he did and couldn't stop the words coming out like water through a crack in a dam. Cool even in August. He learned to swim there. 4 years old and fearless. She had to watch him every second or he'd go under just to scare her. Come up laughing and spitting water. His voice broke on the last word. The coffee cup sat on the table untouched now. His shoulders were rigid beneath his shirt, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. Claire dried her hands on the cloth, turned around. Mr. Cooper. He didn't look up. What was her name? The question hung in the air. Somewhere outside, crickets had begun to sing a high, steady sound that filled the silence. The heat of the day was fading, leaving behind the cool quiet of a Texas night. The lamp flame guttered in a draft from somewhere, throwing shadows across his face. Ethan pushed back from the table. The chair legs scraped against the floor with a sound like a cry. I'll show you to your room, he said. The room was small, a narrow bed with a quilt folded at the foot, faded colors and hand-stitched squares, the work of someone who had taken care with every stitch. A washstand with a chipped basin, a crack running through the porcelain like a scar. A window that looked out on nothing but darkness and the faint shapes of mesquite trees against the stars. The walls were bare except for a single nail, empty and waiting a small wound in the plaster that spoke of absence. This was my wife's sewing room, Ethan said, stopping in the doorway, his hand gripping the frame, the knuckles white. There's clean sheets in the chest. Breakfast is at 5. He turned to go. Mr. Cooper. He paused but did not turn around. Thank you, Claire said, for bringing me here, for the work. A long moment passed. His back was to her, his shoulders a dark shape against the lamplight from the hall. She could hear him breathing slow and deliberate, the breath of a man holding something in. Don't thank me yet, he said. This land takes more than it gives. He walked away, his boots sounding on the floorboards, then on the porch. The screen door opened and closed with a slap. Claire sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was thin, stuffed with corn husks that rustled beneath her weight like whispers. She looked around the room at the small space that would be hers at the nail on the wall at the window that showed nothing but night. The quilt smelled of cedar and something else, lavender, maybe faint and almost gone. Through the thin walls, she could hear him. Footsteps on the porch, back and forth, back and forth. The creak of boards under his weight, the rhythm of a man who could not rest. She lay down, pulled the quilt over her shoulders, closed her eyes. The footsteps continued. 1 hour. 2. The moon rose and crossed the window and began its descent toward dawn. Sometime deep in the night, the footsteps stopped. Then soft and muffled, coming from somewhere outside, a sound that made Claire's chest tighten. Low, broken. The sound of a man who had held everything in for too long, who had finally reached the limit of what one human soul could contain. Claire lay very still. She did not go to him. She knew somehow that he would not want her to, that this moment was his alone, this release he had denied himself for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. But she did not sleep either. Not for a long, long time. She lay in the darkness of a dead woman's sewing room and listened to a stranger's grief, and for the first time in 12 years of invisible servitude, of being looked through rather than at, she felt like perhaps she mattered. Perhaps her presence here in this house in this moment served some purpose beyond mere survival. 4 in the morning, the sky still black outside the window. Ethan pulled on his boots in the dark, the leather stiff and cold against his feet. His muscles ached from yesterday's work, hauling water, mending fence, checking on cattle that grew thinner by the day. The same work he had done every day for 3 years. The same emptiness waiting for him in the kitchen. He walked down the hall, the floorboards creaking under his weight, pushed open the door to the main room, and stopped. Light, warm and yellow, spilling from the kitchen doorway. The smell of coffee, strong and black and bitter in the best way. Bacon crackling in a pan, the fat popping and hissing. The yeasty scent of biscuits in the oven. Claire stood at the stove, her back to him. She had pinned her hair up, exposing the pale curve of her neck. A worn apron, one he didn't recognize must have been in her trunk, was tied at her waist. She moved with quiet efficiency, flipping bacon with a long fork, checking the biscuits through the oven door. "You're up early," he said. She didn't turn. "So are you." He sat at the table. A plate appeared in front of him. Bacon, the edges crisp and brown. Eggs fried in the bacon grease, the yolk still soft. Biscuits that steamed when he broke them open, the inside white and fluffy. A cup of coffee, dark as night. She sat across from him with her own plate. Ethan bowed his head. "Lord, we thank you for this food and for the hands that made it. Bless this day and the work ahead." "Amen, amen," Claire said quietly. He ate. The bacon was salty and perfect. The eggs were rich. The biscuits melted on his tongue. He could not remember the last time he had tasted food this good, the last time food had been more than fuel, more than the mechanical process of keeping a body functional. When the plates were empty, Ethan pushed back his chair. "I'm going to start on the dam today," he said. "There's a low spot about a mile east where the land dips between 2 rises. If I can build up the banks, there catch the runoff when the rains come." He stopped, swallowed the word if. Might could save what's left of the herd. Claire looked at him, those gray eyes steady and unreadable. "How long will it take?" "Weeks. Maybe longer. Depends on how fast I can dig." She stood, gathered the plates, set them in the basin with a clatter of tin. "I'll come with you." "That ain't necessary. The house needs work. The house can wait." She untied her apron, hung it on the peg by the door. Her movements were quick, certain, the movements of a woman who had made a decision and saw no reason to question it. "Show me where to dig." The sun rose red over the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold that would have been beautiful if they hadn't spoken of drought of air, so dry it scattered light like dust. Ethan and Claire walked in silence, he carrying the pickaxe over his shoulder, the weight familiar against his collarbone, she carrying a shovel and a burlap sack containing biscuits wrapped in cloth and a canteen of water and the tin cup they would share. The grass crunched beneath their boots, dry and brittle, breaking into dust with each step. The air smelled of sage and the faint sweetness of decay from somewhere far off, some animal that had finally given up the fight. The low spot sat at the base of 2 gentle slopes, maybe a quarter mile across. Erosion had carved a shallow bowl in the earth over countless years, and at the far end, A trickle of water, barely more than a seep, a dark stain on the rocks oozed from between the stones. If I build the banks up here and here, Ethan said, pointing with the pickaxe, the water's got nowhere to go but down into the basin. When the rains come, it'll form a pond deep enough to last. Claire studied the terrain, her eyes moving across the slopes, the rocks, the pathetic trickle of water that barely wet the ground before the sun drank it up. How deep does it need to be deep enough to last through a dry spell? 4 feet, maybe 5. She looked at the expanse of hard-packed earth, at the single pickaxe, at the one shovel. Then I reckon we'd best get started, she said. The first hour was the hardest. Ethan swung the pickaxe in steady rhythm, the blade biting into the earth, loosening chunks of clay and stone. The impact jarred up through his arms into his shoulders, down his spine. Behind him, Claire shoveled the debris into a pile, then carried it to the edge of the basin where the banks would rise. The sun climbed, the air grew thick and still heavy as a wool blanket. Sweat soaked through Ethan's shirt, dripped from his chin, fell onto the dry ground where it disappeared like it had never been. He glanced back at Claire. Her dress was dark with moisture clinging to her back. Tendrils of hair had escaped her pins and stuck to her forehead in wet strands. Her face was flushed red, her breath coming in short, harsh gasps. But she did not stop. Scoop, lift, carry, dump, return. Scoop, lift, carry, dump, return. The rhythm never broke. You don't have to do this, Ethan said. She drove the shovel into the dirt, leaned on the handle. Her chest heaved beneath the sweat-soaked fabric of her dress. Neither do you, she said. But here we are. He turned back to the pickaxe. Midday, the sun directly overhead, white and merciless, beating down like a hammer on an anvil. They sat in the shade of a lone oak tree at the edge of the work site, the trunk thick and gnarled, the bark rough against Ethan's back. Claire had brought the biscuits in the canteen. They passed the water back and forth, drinking in small sips to make it last. The water was warm now, tasting of leather and copper, but it was wet. Where are you from? Ethan asked. The question came out before he could think to stop it. Claire wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. A streak of dirt ran across her chin. Pennsylvania, a town called Scranton. Coal country. Yes. She looked out at the brown landscape, so different from anything she had known. Nothing like this. Why did you leave? She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers picking at a loose thread on her sleeve, winding it around and around. I was a maid, she said finally. In a big house, the family that owned the mine, the Harringtons. I worked there for 12 years since I was 16. She paused. When the mother passed on, the son inherited everything. He had notions about what else I ought to do for my wages. Ethan's jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists against his thighs. I left that very night, Claire continued, her voice steady, factual, as if she were recounting something that had happened to someone else. Took a train to Philadelphia. Saw an advertisement in the paper. She smiled, but there was no humor in it, no warmth. Mail-order brides wanted for the Western Territories. Room and board guaranteed. A chance to start fresh. And you believed it. I had nothing else left to believe in. The words hung between them like smoke. Ethan looked at his hands, calloused, dirt-caked, the nails broken and black with grime. My wife's name was Margaret, he said. Claire went still beside him. We met at a church social in Austin. I was 22. She was 19. Prettiest girl I ever saw. Dark hair, green eyes, a laugh that made you feel like everything was right with the world. He picked up a stick, drew a line in the dust. Her father didn't approve. Said I had nothing to offer. He was right, too. But she married you anyway. She said she'd rather be poor with me than rich with anyone else. The stick snapped between his fingers, the sound sharp in the still air. Turns out she got both, poor and alone. You weren't alone. You had each other for a while. He threw the broken stick away, watched it land in the dust. The fever came through in the fall of '84. Took half the county. Took her. Took our boy. How old was he? 4. The word came out broken, like something cracked. Ethan cleared his throat. His name was Thomas. He wanted to be a cowboy. Used to follow me around with a stick for a gun, saying, bang, bang, pow, you're dead. Claire said nothing. She reached over and placed her hand on his arm just for a moment, just long enough for him to feel the warmth of her palm through his sleeve. Then she pulled it back. We should get back to work, she said. Ethan nodded, rose to his feet. His legs ached. His back screamed with deep, grinding pain. They walked back to the dig site in silence. But something had shifted between them. The distance had shrunk. The space felt different now, smaller, more like two people working together than two strangers enduring proximity. Late afternoon, the shadows growing long across the dry earth. Claire drove her shovel into the ground lifted. Her foot slipped on a patch of loose clay. She stumbled forward, arms pinwheeling, and went down hard into the mud. She sat there at the bottom of the shallow pit covered in brown muck from waist to boots. Her hair had come completely undone, hanging in wet ropes around her face. A streak of dirt ran across her cheek like war paint. Ethan stared. And then a sound came out of him, rough and rusty and unfamiliar, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. It took him a moment to realize he was laughing. Claire looked up at him, her eyes going wide, shocked. "Are you laughing at me, Mr. Cooper?" "No, ma'am." He reached down, offered his hand, his shoulders still shaking. "I wouldn't dare." She took it, her grip strong, her fingers slick with mud. He pulled her to her feet. That was when he saw her palms. The skin was raw and red, angry as a burn. Blisters had formed across the base of her fingers, then broken open, weeping clear fluid. Fresh blood mixed with the dirt and mud running down her wrists. The laughter died in his throat. "Why didn't you say something?" His voice came out sharper than he intended. "It's nothing. It ain't nothing." He held her hands in his, turning them over gently. The wounds were inflamed, the edges white and puckered. "You've been working like this all day." The work needed doing. He looked at her face, at the stubborn set of her jaw, at the gray eyes that refused to show pain even now. "Wait here." He walked back to where they had left their supplies. In the burlap sack beneath the remaining biscuits was a small tin. He had packed it out of habit, the salve Margaret used to make from lard and dried calendula and a bit of beeswax. He had kept making it after she died, though he could not have said why. The smell of it brought her back. Her hands working the mixture, the kitchen warm with the scent of herbs. He returned to Claire, opened the tin. The smell rose up familiar, achingly so. "Give me your hands." She hesitated, then extended them, palms up. He dipped his fingers into the salve, began to work it into her wounds gently, carefully. The medicine was cool against her heated skin. She flinched once, a quick intake of breath, but did not pull away. "This will help," he said. "Keep the infection out." "Thank you." He looked up. Their faces were close, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her gray eyes, close enough to see the pulse beating in her throat, close enough to feel her breath warm on his cheek. The moment stretched, and then a sound. Hoofbeats, coming fast from the direction of the main road, drumming against the hard-packed earth like thunder. Ethan released her hands, stepped back, turned toward the noise. A rider was approaching, a big man on a black horse, kicking up a plume of dust against the fading light. Ethan's hand moved instinctively toward his hip, but he had left his gun at the house, an oversight he was already regretting. The rider pulled up short, the horse lathered and blowing hard foam dripping from the bit. Clayton Hargrove, 52 years old, the richest man in the county, owner of 10,000 acres and the souls of half the people who lived on them. He sat his horse like a king, surveying his domain, his gray suit immaculate despite the heat, his gold watch chain gleaming against his vest. His face was broad and red, the face of a man who ate well and often. A thick mustache covered his upper lip, waxed at the ends. His eyes moved from Ethan to Claire to the half-built dam, taking measure, calculating. "Cooper," he said, his voice smooth and friendly, wrong somehow, like honey poured over something rotten. "Heard you were building something out here." Ethan said nothing, just stood there watching, waiting. "Quite the project." "Chan." Hargrove's gaze swept across the basin, the piles of displaced earth. "Must have been at it for days." "What do you want, Hargrove?" The big man smiled, showing white teeth. "Direct. I always did like that about you, Cooper. No wasted words." He shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking. "I heard tell about your little dam. Thought I'd ride over and see it for myself. You've seen it. Now you can go." "In a minute." Hargrove's smile faded, the mask slipping. "We need to talk first about this water you're collecting." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What about it? You know where it comes from?" "The seep? And where does the seep come from?" Hargrove leaned forward in his saddle. "It comes from runoff. Runoff that used to flow downhill onto my land. That water has watered my cattle for 40 years. My father relied on it. I rely on it. The runoff dried up 2 months ago. Because there ain't been no rain. But when the rain comes, and it will come sooner or later, that water belongs to me. Hargrove's voice hardened, the friendly tone dropping away like a shed skin. You're stealing my water, Cooper. Ethan felt anger rise in his chest, hot and tight. He pushed it down, kept his voice level. That water don't belong to you. It don't belong to anyone. It comes from the hills, flows through the land, and goes where it goes. You don't own the rain, Hargrove. I own the land it falls on. Not this land. They stood face to face now, close enough that Ethan could smell the tobacco on Hargrove's breath, the pomade in his hair, something sharp underneath, like sweat gone sour. I'm going to make this real simple, Hargrove said. I want to buy your ranch, all of it. The house, the cattle, the land. He paused, letting the words sink in. And this here dam. It ain't for sale. Everything's for sale, Cooper. It's just a question of price. Hargrove reached into his coat, pulled out a folded piece of paper. I'm prepared to offer you $3,500. Cash money. You can take it and start over somewhere else. California, maybe. I hear the weather's right pleasant out that way. $3,500. It was more money than Ethan had seen in his entire life. More than the ranch was worth, especially now, with the cattle dying and the debts piling up. No, he said. Hargrove's eyebrows rose. No, I was born on this land. My father built that house with his own two hands. My wife is buried here. My son is buried here. Ethan's voice was steady, though his heart pounded against his ribs like something trying to escape. I ain't leaving. That's sentiment talking. I'm offering you a future. I got a future right here. Hargrove's jaw tightened. The friendly mask fell away completely, now revealing something harder underneath something cold and mean. You're making a mistake, Cooper. Maybe so, but it's my mistake to make. The silence stretched between them. One of Hargrove's men spat tobacco juice into the dust. The sun was setting now, painting the sky blood red. Hargrove's eyes moved past Ethan to where Claire stood watching from the edge of the dig site, the shovel still in her hands. His gaze lingered there, something unreadable crossing his face. Well, well, he said, walking his horse closer. Who do we have here? Claire did not move, did not speak. She held the shovel in front of her knuckles, white around the handle. Hargrove stopped in front of her, looked her up and down with an appraising gaze that made Ethan's fist clench. Where'd you come from, sweetheart? I don't recall seeing you in town. His smile widened, showing teeth. Let me guess. Ordered from a catalog. Cooper finally got tired of keeping his own company. That's enough. Ethan's voice was low, dangerous. He did not recognize the sound of it. Hargrove turned, just making conversation. Cooper, no need to get your hackles up. Make it somewhere else. Touchy, touchy, Hargrove laughed. She must be something special, this one. He looked at Claire again. What's your name, honey? Her name ain't none of your concern. Ethan stepped between them, his hands shaking with the effort of keeping it at his side. She's family, and you need to leave. Now, family. Hargrove's eyebrows rose high on his forehead. I didn't know you had any family left, Cooper. Thought the fever took care of that. The words hit like a fist to the gut. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. Get off my land. The two men stared at each other. Something passed between them, a recognition perhaps of lines drawn and boundaries tested, of wars declared without a single shot fired. Hargrove stepped back, raised his hands in mock surrender. All right. I can see you ain't in a negotiating mood today. He walked back to his horse, mounted with the easy grace of a man who had spent his whole life in the saddle. But you think about my offer, Cooper. $3,500. It's a generous price for a dying ranch and a stubborn fool. The ranch ain't dying, not yet. Hargrove gathered his reins. But things change, droughts get worse, cattle die, accidents happen. His eyes glittered in the fading light. There's all kinds of ways to make a man change his mind. He wheeled his horse around. His men fell in behind him. They rode off the way they had come, leaving nothing behind but hoofprints in the dust and the smell of threat hanging heavy in the still air. Ethan stood there long after they disappeared, his heart still hammering, his hands still trembling with suppressed violence. Claire came to stand beside him. Her face was pale beneath the sunburn. He'll come back, won't he? Yes. What will you do? Ethan did not answer. He looked down at his hands, empty, calloused, shaking slightly. Then he turned toward the house and started walking. Claire followed, questions forming on her lips, but something in the set of his shoulders told her to wait, to give him space, to let whatever was happening inside him happen without interference. Inside the house, Ethan went straight to the fireplace. Above the mantel, mounted on wooden pegs worn smooth with age, hung a Winchester rifle. It had been his father's before him. He had not touched it in 3 years, not since the day he had considered using it on himself, and decided he was too much of a coward even for that. His fingers brushed the stock, cool and smooth and familiar. "Don't," he turned. Claire stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dying light. "Don't," she said again. "That's what he wants. He wants you to do something foolish, something he can use against you. He threatened us. With words. Words ain't bullets." Ethan's hand fell away from the rifle. He stood there, breathing hard, staring at the weapon. "My father told me once that a man who picks up a gun better be ready to use it, and a man who uses it better be ready to live with what comes after." His voice was quiet now, drained. "Are you ready?" The question hung in the air. Ethan closed his eyes. He saw Margaret's face, Thomas's grin, the two graves on the hillside side by side, marked with wooden crosses he had carved with his own hands while his world ended around him. "No," he said, "I ain't." He walked past Claire, out of the house, back toward the dig site. After a moment, he heard her footsteps following. They worked until full dark, neither speaking. When the light failed completely, they gathered their tools and walked back to the house in silence. That night, lying in his bed, Ethan heard something he hadn't heard in months. Horses. Distant but unmistakable, moving slowly along the ridge that marked the boundary between his land and Hargrove's. He went to the window, looked out. Moonlight, empty fields, silence. But he knew. Someone was watching. Someone was waiting. And whatever came next, he would have to be ready for it. The first cow died at dawn. Ethan found her behind the barn, lying on her side in the dust, her eyes open and glazed, staring at nothing. Her tongue hung from her mouth, swollen and black, crusted with dirt. Flies had already found her, a dark, buzzing cloud that rose when he approached, then settled again, industrious and patient. He stood over the body for a long time, his hands at his sides, his mind empty, scraped clean like a bone left in the sun. This was the 6th one in 2 weeks. The herd was dying faster than he could dig graves. Ethan walked to the shed, got the shovel, and started digging. The ground was hard as iron, each thrust of the blade sending jolts up through his arms. The sun climbed higher, burning away what little moisture the night had left in the air. Sweat ran down his back, soaked through his shirt, dripped from his chin, into the hole that grew inch by stubborn inch. By noon, 2 more were dead. The cattle had gathered around the water trough, but the trough was empty. The well had given up its last bucket that morning. Brown water, more mud than liquid, smelling of rotten iron. Ethan had poured it into the trough anyway, watched the animals fight over it, shoving and lowing, lapping at the sludge with desperate tongues. It was not enough. It would never be enough. He dragged the third carcass to the pit behind the barn, hauling it by the hind legs through the dust. The animal weighed maybe 600 pounds of dead weight. Ethan's arms screamed as he pulled his boots, slipping on patches of loose earth. His grip failed. He went down backward, landing hard on his tailbone, the dead cow's legs still clutched in his hands. He lay there in the dirt, staring up at the white, empty sky. The sun beat down without mercy. Flies buzzed around his head, landed on his face, crawled across his lips. He could taste them, the bitter tang of death and decay. "Get up," he told himself. "Get up." His body did not move. The smell of the dead cow filled his nose, blood and bile and the first sour hint of rot. His shirt was soaked through with sweat, plastered to his skin. His trousers were caked with mud, and worse. He could feel the grit between his teeth, taste the dust on his tongue. Get up. He could not. Claire found him an hour later, still lying beside the carcass, staring at nothing. She did not speak. She simply knelt beside him, slipped her arm under his shoulders, and helped him to his feet. His legs shook, his head swam. He leaned on her more than he wanted to admit, more than he had leaned on anyone since Margaret died. "We need supplies," she said quietly. "From town." Ethan shook his head, the movement slow and heavy. "I'll go tomorrow. We need them today." Claire's voice was firm but not unkind. "The flour is gone. The coffee is gone. We got nothing for supper." He looked at her, at her sunburned face, at the dirt caked in the lines around her eyes, at the way she held herself straight despite everything. Despite him. "All right," he said. I'll go. The ride to Red Creek took 2 hours. Ethan sat slumped in the saddle, his horse plodding along the dusty road at a walk. The animal was thin now, ribs showing through its hide like the bars of a cage. It had been a good horse once, strong and fast. Now it was just another thing dying by inches, another responsibility Ethan was failing. The town appeared on the horizon, a cluster of wooden buildings bleached pale by the sun. A church steeple rising above the rest. A water tower that had stood empty for weeks, the words Red Creek painted on its side in letters that were flaking away like dead skin. Ethan tied his horse outside the general store, climbed the steps. His boots sounded hollow on the boards, each step an effort, each movement requiring thought and will. He pushed open the door. The conversation inside stopped. 3 men stood at the counter. Old Henderson, who ran the feed store, a man Ethan had known for 20 years. Young Pete McClin, whose father owned the livery, and Wade Bishop, Clayton Hargrove's foreman, a thick-necked man with a scar running down his cheek like a dried riverbed. They all turned to look at Ethan. The silence was immediate and total, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words ever could. Cooper, Henderson said. His voice was cool, distant, like talking to a stranger. Didn't expect to see you in town. Ethan walked to the counter, his eyes straight ahead. Needed supplies. I'll bet you do. Wade Bishop's voice carried across the store loud enough for everyone to hear. Hard to keep a ranch running when you're hoarding all the water for yourself. Ethan's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists at his sides. I ain't hoarding anything. That ain't what I heard. Wade pushed off from where he'd been leaning against a barrel of nails. Word is you're building a dam up there, catching all the runoff before it can reach anyone else's land. That ain't true. No, Wade smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. Then what are you doing with all that water? Ethan felt the eyes on him. Henderson, McClin, the store clerk behind the counter, his hand frozen on a bolt of cloth. Others, too, gathering in the doorway, drawn by the sound of raised voices, by the prospect of confrontation in a town where nothing ever happened. The dam is for everyone, he said, his voice steady despite the anger rising in his chest. When the rains come, the water will collect in the basin. Anyone who needs it can come and take their share. That was always the plan. Sure it was. Wade took another step closer. His hand rested on the butt of the pistol at his hip. Casual, almost lazy, but the threat was clear. And I reckon you were fixing to tell everyone about this generous offer. Or were you going to wait until we was all desperate, then charge us for the privilege? I wasn't going to charge anyone. Easy to say now. Wade was close now, close enough that Ethan could smell the chewing tobacco on his breath, the sweat in his clothes. But Mr. Hargrove tells a different story. Says you've been stealing water that belongs to him. Says you got no right to that land, no right to that dam, no right to any of it. Hargrove's a liar. The words came out before Ethan could stop them, hard and final, echoing in the sudden silence of the store. Wade's smile vanished. His hand moved to his pistol, gripping it, his thumb on the hammer. You want to say that again? Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. His hands were empty. He had left his gun at home, an oversight that seemed monumentally stupid now. He was unarmed, surrounded by men who looked at him with suspicion, at best hostility, at worst. I said Hargrove is a liar. His voice did not waver, though his knees felt like water. He wants my land. He's been wanting it for years. This dam business is just an excuse. The dam is theft. Wade's fingers curled around his pistol, grip, the knuckles going white. And you know what we do with thieves around here. That's enough. A new voice. Calm, quiet, but carrying the weight of authority that comes from decades of moral certainty. Ethan turned. Reverend Abel Cross stood in the doorway of the general store. He was a small man, 72 years old, with white hair, thin as corn silk, and a face like weathered leather. He had baptized Ethan as an infant, had married Ethan and Margaret, in the little white church at the edge of town, had spoken the words over their graves, while Ethan stood silent, unable to cry, unable to feel anything but the vast emptiness where his heart used to be. This ain't none of your concern, Preacher, Wade said, though his hand loosened slightly on the pistol. Everything that happens in this ayin is my concern. Cross walked into the store, his footsteps slow but steady, the steps of a man who had walked a long road and was not afraid of what lay ahead. And I reckon I've heard quite enough accusations for one day. Accusations? Wade's voice rose. Cooper here is stealing water that belongs to Mr. Hargrove. Mr. Hargrove says many things. Cross stopped beside Ethan, looked up at him with those faded blue eyes. that had seen so much, had witnessed births and deaths and everything between. But I ain't never known a Cooper to steal anything. Then you don't know them as well as you reckon. Perhaps not. Cross turned to face the crowd that had gathered, the people of Red Creek who had come to watch a man be destroyed. Or perhaps I know them better than those who spread rumors for their own benefit. His gaze moved to Wade, steady and unblinking. Mr. Hargrove has been buying up land in this county for 15 years. Every drought, every hard winter, he swoops in and offers pennies on the dollar to desperate families. He paused, letting the words sink in. I wonder how many of you folks remember that. Silence, uncomfortable shifting, eyes that would not eat Cross's gaze. There will be a town meeting, the Reverend said Sunday. After services, everyone will have a chance to speak their piece, including Ethan, including Mr. Hargrove if he's of a mind to show up. He looked at Wade. Tell your employer he's invited. If he's got accusations to make, he can make them to all of us. In public, where we can all hear the truth and judge for ourselves. Wade's jaw worked, grinding teeth. His hand fell away from his pistol. Mr. Hargrove ain't going to be happy about this. Mr. Hargrove's happiness ain't my concern. Cross turned back to Ethan. Go home, son. Get some rest. Sunday is 3 days away. The ride home was longer than the ride in. Ethan slumped in the saddle, the bag of supplies tied behind him, his mind turning over what had happened, what it meant. The town was divided. Some would support him, but many more feared Hargrove owed Hargrove money or land or favors that could never be repaid. Sunday would decide everything. The sun was setting when he reached the ranch, the sky painted red and orange colors that meant nothing anymore. Colors that were just light and air and the absence of water. Claire was waiting on the porch. She stood when she saw him coming, her face pale in the fading light. What happened? She asked. He dismounted, tied the horse to the rail, walked past her without speaking. Inside, he found the bottle of whiskey in the cabinet above the sink, the bottle he had bought 3 years ago and never opened because opening it would mean admitting defeat. He pulled the cork with his teeth, poured a glass. His hand shook so badly that the whiskey sloshed over the rim, spilling onto the floor, the smell of it rising up sharp and burning. He drank anyway, the liquid fire in his throat settling in his empty stomach. Like punishment. Ethan. Claire stood in the doorway watching. He poured another glass, drank it. The whiskey burned. Good. He wanted to burn, wanted to feel something other than this crushing weight of failure. Maybe I should just sell. The words came out slurred, bitter, soaked in defeat. Maybe Hargrove's right. I can't keep anything alive. His voice broke. Couldn't keep the cattle alive. Couldn't keep them alive neither. He stared at the whiskey in his glass, at his reflection distorted in the amber liquid, warped and broken. I promised to take care of them. Promised I'd protect them. He laughed, a hollow, ugly sound that did not belong in a human throat. I break everything I touch. Every single thing. He threw the glass. It shattered against the wall, whiskey running down the wood like tears, like blood, like everything he had failed to save. Claire did not flinch. She walked toward him. Her footsteps steady on the wooden floor, stopped in front of him, looked up at his face. You kept your word to me, she said quietly. That ain't the same. You gave me a home when no one else would. You treated me with dignity when I had none left. Her voice was fierce now, burning with its own kind of fire. You kept your integrity, even when Hargrove tried to buy you, even when his man put his hand on his gun. She stepped closer. That is something he can never take from you. That is something he can never buy. Ethan stared at her, his vision blurred, his chest heaving. I don't know how to keep going. The words came out broken, barely more than a whisper. I don't know how to do this no more. Claire reached up, placed her hand against his cheek, her palm warm and rough with calluses, with the evidence of shared labor. Then let me help you. They stood there in the wreckage of his despair, two broken people holding each other up in the fading light, and for just a moment, Ethan felt the weight lift, just a fraction, just enough to breathe. That night, Ethan sat on the porch steps, watching the darkness settle over the land like a blanket. Claire sat beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her shoulder against his. Neither spoke. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant and uncaring. The wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like whispering. like the voices of all the people he had failed, all the promises he had broken, and then lights, torches. Half a dozen of them moving across the ridge to the east like fireflies in the dark, bobbing and weaving through the night. Ethan stood, his blood running cold. The lights were heading toward the dam. Ethan ran. His boots pounded against the hard-packed earth. His lungs burned the night air cold against his sweat-soaked skin. The torches moved across the ridge like a procession of ghosts. 6 points of flame in the darkness, converging on the place where he and Claire had to spend 2 weeks digging hope out of the ground. He had no gun, no weapon, nothing but his hands and his legs, and the blood hammering in his ears like war drums. The dam came into view, moonlight glinting off the shallow pool that had collected in the basin, weeks of work, weeks of sweat and blisters and aching muscles, all of it sitting there in the silver light, waiting to be destroyed. 5 men stood at the edge of the dam, their torches throwing dancing shadows across the ground, making the water shimmer like something alive. Wade Bishop held a pickaxe raised above his head, the blade catching the firelight, poised to strike to undo everything. Ethan stumbled to a stop 20 feet away, his chest heaving, his voice coming out raw and broken. "Don't!" Wade turned the torchlight, catching the scar on his face, making it look fresh and angry, like a wound that had never healed. "Cooper." He lowered the pickaxe, slightly smiled that yellow-toothed smile. "Didn't expect you so soon. Please." The word tore itself from Ethan's throat, desperate and naked. He did not recognize his own voice, the pleading in it. The fear, "Please don't do this." Mr. Hargrove's orders. Wade shrugged as if this made everything simple, as if following orders absolved a man of responsibility for his actions. "Nothing personal, you understand. It's everything personal." Ethan stepped forward, his legs shaking beneath him, his hands empty and useless. "This dam, this water, it ain't just for me, it's for everyone, the whole town. The town can get water from Mr. Hargrove." Wade's smile widened. "He'll sell it to them. Fair price." "And what happens when he raises that price?" Ethan's voice was rising now, desperation giving way to anger. "When folks can't pay, he'll own everyone, every farm, every family. Is that what you want?" Wade's smile faltered, just for a moment, a flicker of something human behind the mask of the hired gun. "I don't want anything," he said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "I just do what I'm told. You're a man, ain't you?" Ethan took another step, his eyes locked on Wade's. "You make your own choices. You don't have to do this." The other men shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a young man barely more than a boy, his face smooth and pale in the torchlight, looked down at the torch in his hand like he was seeing it for the first time. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. "Mr. Bishop," the boy said. His voice cracked. "Maybe we ought to reconsider this." "Shut your mouth, Danny." "But he's right." Danny's voice grew stronger. "My ma lives in town. She can barely afford water as it is. If Mr. Hargrove controls everything, if he can charge whatever he wants, then we're all at his mercy." I said, "Shut it." Danny fell silent, but he did not move. He stood there, torch in hand, staring at the dam, like he was seeing it, really seeing it for the first time. Not as an obstacle to be destroyed, but as something that might save his mother, might save them all. Ethan looked at the other men, recognizing some of their faces now in the wavering light. Tom Hadley's nephew, who had lost his father to the fever the same year Ethan lost Margaret and Thomas. Marcus Webb's cousin, whose farm had failed 2 years back, bought up by Hargrove for a fraction of its worth. Men who had grievances of their own. Men who had reasons to hate Hargrove as much as anyone. "You all know me," Ethan said. His voice was steadier now, finding its strength and truth. "You knew my father. You know what kind of man I am." He spread his hands, showing them empty, showing them he came in peace, came in honesty. "I ain't your enemy. Hargrove is." "Pretty words, Cooper." Wade's jaw tightened. "But they don't change nothing. They change everything." Ethan stepped closer, close enough now to see the sweat beading on Wade's forehead, the uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "You can destroy this dam tonight. You can do what Hargrove wants. But then what?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air. "You go home, you look at yourself in the mirror come morning, you live with what you done." The torches crackled and hissed. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called 2 notes rising into the night. "Or you can walk away," Ethan continued. "Tell Hargrove you couldn't find it in the dark. Tell him whatever you want. But walk away knowing you did the right thing, the decent thing. Wade stared at him, the pickaxe hanging loose in his grip, now the weight of it pulling his arms down. Behind him, Danny set his torch down on the ground. The flame sputtered in the dirt, then steadied. "I ain't doing this," the boy said quietly. His voice was steady now, certain. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bishop. I just can't." Another man followed, setting down his torch, stepping back from the dam. Then another, and another. One by one they moved away, their torches lowering, their faces turning from the firelight into shadow. Wade stood alone, his knuckles white around the pickaxe handle, his breath coming hard and fast, fogging in the cool night air. Ethan could see the war playing out behind his eyes. Fear of Hargrove, fear of himself, fear of the man he might become if he swung that blade. "Your choice," Ethan said quietly. "Nobody else's." The pickaxe trembled in Wade's hands. And then slowly, painfully, like a man surrendering the last piece of his soul, he let it fall to the ground. It landed with a dull thud, the sound final and irrevocable. "This ain't over." Wade's voice was hollow, defeated. "Mr. Hargrove won't let it go." "I know." Wade turned, walked past his men without looking at them, his shoulders hunched, his head down. The others followed one by one, melting into the darkness like ghosts, like men who had looked into their own souls and not liked what they found there. Danny was the last to go. He stopped beside Ethan, opened his mouth to speak, then just shook his head and walked away. Ethan stood alone at the edge of the dam, his whole body shaking with released tension, with the adrenaline that had nowhere to go now that the crisis had passed. His legs gave out. He sank to his knees in the dirt, his hands pressed flat against the ground, his head bowed. The moon hung overhead, cold and distant. The water gleamed in the basin, still and perfect. The dam still stood. But for how long? Hoofbeats, fast and hard, coming from the direction of the house. Claire appeared on horseback, Winchester rifle across her saddle, her hair wild from the ride. She pulled up short when she saw Ethan kneeling alone, saw the abandoned torches guttering in the dirt, saw the dam intact. She dismounted, ran to him, dropped to her knees beside him. "Are you hurt?" "No," his voice was thick. "They're gone. They left." Claire looked at the dam, at the water, at the pickaxe lying in the dust. Then she looked at Ethan, and something in her eyes made his chest tighten. "You stopped them. Not with guns, not with violence, just with words, just with truth," he said. "That's harder." She reached for his hand, and this time he did not pull away. He let her fingers curl around his, let her warmth seep into his cold skin. They sat there together in the moonlight, two people who had learned the hard way that the greatest battles are not fought with weapons, but with conviction, with the stubborn refusal to become the thing your enemies expect you to be. Sunday morning. The church was full, every seat taken. Folks stood along the walls, crowded into the doorway, spilled out onto the steps. The whole town had come, 200 souls crammed into a space meant for half that, the air thick with the smell of candle wax and hair oil, and the faint mustiness of hymnals that only saw daylight once a week. Ethan sat in the back pew, Claire beside him. He wore his only suit, the one he had bought for Margaret's funeral, and hadn't touched since the fabric stiff with disuse, the collar too tight around his throat. Claire wore her best dress, the blue one she'd arrived in, washed and mended, the fabric soft from years of wear. Every eye in that church was on them, some curious, some suspicious, some openly hostile. Reverend Cross stood at the pulpit, his white hair catching the light that streamed through the stained glass windows, red and gold and blue painting patterns on the wooden floor. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of 7 decades of witnessing human nature at its best and worst. "We are gathered here to settle a matter that has divided this community, the matter of Ethan Cooper's dam." A murmur ran through the crowd. Ethan felt the weight of their attention heavy as stones. In the front pew, Clayton Hargrove sat flanked by a man in a city suit, a lawyer by the look of him, and 2 ranch hands. Hargrove wore his finest clothes, his gold watch chain gleaming against his vest. His face was calm, confident, the face of a man who had already won. "Mr. Hargrove," Cross said, "you have made accusations against Mr. Cooper. Would you care to speak first?" Hargrove rose, walked to the front of the church with the easy stride of a man accustomed to being listened to. He turned to face the congregation, his hands clasped behind his back. "Friends," he said, his voice warm and reasonable, "I ain't here to make accusations. I'm here to state facts." He smiled, that practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Ethan Cooper has built a dam on his property. A dam that captures water that would otherwise flow onto my land. Water that my cattle need to survive. Water that my father relied on for 40 years. Water that I rely on now. He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the people absorb the logic of property rights and prior use. I offered to buy Mr. Cooper's property at a fair price. More than fair, truth be told. $3,500. But he refused. Hargrove shook his head, the picture of reasonable confusion. I don't understand why. His ranch is failing, his cattle are dying. What does he stand to gain by holding on? Unless he paused for effect, unless he intends to control the water. To control all of you, he pointed at Ethan, his finger steady and accusing. He'll charge you when you're desperate. Mark my words. This ain't about survival, it's about power. The lawyer stepped forward, then pulling papers from his briefcase, quoting Texas water law, talking about prior appropriation, about how the person who uses water first has superior rights to those who come after. His voice was dry and precise, the voice of a man who believes the law is always right even when it's cruel. When the lawyer finished, Reverend Cross looked at Ethan. Mr. Cooper, would you like to respond? Ethan stood, his heart hammered against his ribs. Public speaking had never been his strength. He was a man of action, of work, of doing rather than talking. But sometimes words were the only weapon you had. He walked down the aisle, his boots loud on the wooden floor, stopped in the center where everyone could see him. Reverend, he said, folks, I'm not good with speeches. I'm a soldier, a rancher. I work with my hands. His hands hung at his sides, calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who had dug graves and built fences and tried to hold on to something while the world did its best to take it away. But I know right from wrong, he looked at Hargrove. Mr. Hargrove says I'm stealing water. But that water ain't fallen yet. How can I steal something that doesn't exist? He turned to face the congregation. The dam I'm building, I'm not building it for myself alone. My well is dry, same as Tom Hadley's well, same as Marcus Webb's well, same as 20 other families in this room. His voice grew stronger. When the rains come, and they will come, the dam will hold water, and anyone who needs it can take it. Free. No charge. No questions asked. He looked back at Hargrove. But Mr. Hargrove, he's been selling water to Jim Peterson for $2 a barrel. I've got the receipt. Hargrove stood, his face flushing red. That's a lie. Jim Ethan's voice cut across the church. You want to stand up? A man in his 50s rose slowly from a pew near the middle, his face pale, his hands shaking. It's true, he said quietly. I paid $50 for 25 barrels last week. My children were thirsty. The church erupted in whispers and accusations and the sound of trust breaking. Mrs. Abigail Henderson stood, her cane tapping sharply on the floor. I'm 78 years old, she said, her voice carrying despite her age. I've seen droughts before. I've seen good men and bad men. Clayton Hargrove. I remember your father. Hargrove's face went rigid. He came here broke and hungry. Mrs. Henderson's voice was hard as iron. My husband gave him work, fed him at our table, taught him ranching. And when my husband died, your father bought our land for half what it was worth when we couldn't pay our debts. She pointed her cane at him. You're just like him, a vulture. Then she turned to Ethan and her face softened. Ethan Cooper, his father built the first schoolhouse in this town. His mother nursed half of us through cholera. And Ethan himself has never turned away anyone in need. She sat down heavily. I know who I trust. Tom Hadley stood. 3 years ago, my wife died of the same fever that took Ethan's family. I couldn't dig her grave. My hands were shaking. My mind was gone. Ethan dug it for me, sat with me for 3 days, didn't ask for nothing. Marcus Webb rose. My wagon broke down 20 miles out. Axle snapped. Ethan rode out, fixed, it wouldn't take payment. Said neighbors help neighbors. One by one, 8 people stood and spoke. Stories of kindness, of help given without expectation of return, of a man who had lost everything, but had not let that loss turn him cruel. Danny Freeman, the boy from the night at the dam, stood last. Mr. Cooper gave me work when nobody else would. Paid fair. Treated me like a man, not a kid. And 3 nights ago, when Mr. Hargrove sent us to destroy the dam, his voice broke slightly. Mr. Cooper didn't shoot. He talked. He showed us what was right. Hargrove stood, his face purple with rage. This is all very touching, but it doesn't change the law. The law, Claire's voice rang out clear and strong, is not always the same as what's right. Every head turned. Claire stood in the back pew, her hands gripping the wood in front of her. May I speak? Reverend Cross nodded. Of course, Mrs. Hartford. Claire walked down the aisle, her steps measured, her chin lifted. When she reached the front, she turned to face the congregation, and Ethan saw her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. I'm not from here, she said. I'm an outsider, a mail-order bride that nobody wanted. I have no right to speak about land, about water, about law. She paused. But I know about people. She looked at Hargrove. Mr. Hargrove, you say Ethan wants to control people. But do you know what he's done these past 3 weeks? She stepped forward. He's worked 16 hours a day under a 110-degree sun. His hands are blistered. His back aches. But he doesn't stop. Not for money, not for power. Her voice grew fierce. Because he sees cattle dying. He sees children going thirsty. He sees a community suffering. And he can't sit still. She turned to the congregation. I've lived 32 years invisible, working in other people's house, eating leftovers, wearing hand-me-downs. Nobody ever looked at me like I was human. She looked at Ethan and her eyes were wet. Until he did. He gave me work. He gave me dignity. He gave me hope. He didn't ask who I was, didn't care where I came from. He just saw someone who needed help, and he helped. A tear ran down her cheek. That's the man you're questioning. A man who lost his wife, lost his child, but still chose to help a stranger. A man who's building something not for himself, but for all of you. She turned back to Hargrove, her voice dropping to something cold and hard. And you, Mr. Hargrove, what have you lost? Do you understand pain? Or do you only understand power? The silence in the church was absolute. Hargrove's face had gone pale. For just a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Something that might have been grief, might have been recognition. He looked at Claire like he was seeing someone else, someone from long ago. Reverend Cross's voice broke the silence. Does anyone else wish to speak? No one moved? Then we shall vote. All in favor of allowing Mr. Cooper to keep his dam, please stand. 1 second of silence. Then Mrs. Henderson stood, her movements slow but deliberate. Tom Hadley rose. Marcus Webb, Danny Freeman, and the 4 men who had helped at the dam. Then more. 10, 20, 50, 100. The sound of scraping wood filled the church as person after person rose to their feet until 180 of the 200 people in that room were standing, leaving only Hargrove, his lawyer, his ranch hands, and a handful of people who owed him money they could never repay. Hargrove looked around, saw himself isolated, saw the town he thought he controlled, choosing someone else. He stood. His face was expressionless, now empty. He walked down the aisle without a word, his men following. At the door, he paused, looked back at Ethan. Something passed between them. Not hatred, not respect, something else entirely, the recognition of a battle lost. Then he was gone. After the service, people surrounded Ethan and Claire. Handshakes, promises of help. Tom Hadley clapped Ethan on the shoulder. We'll finish that dam together. But the celebration was short-lived. Henry Wolfe pushed through the crowd, his face flushed, breathing hard. Ethan storm, clouds building west. Big ones. Ethan looked where Henry pointed. On the western horizon, massive thunderheads piled against the sky, dark and heavy lightning flickering in their depths. How long? 6 hours, Henry said. Maybe less. The dam wasn't finished. It needed another foot of height. The spillway needed reinforcement. 6 hours wasn't enough time, unless they had help. Reverend Cross raised his voice. Folks, the dam's not complete. We need every able body. Within the hour, 60 people descended on the worksite. Men with shovels and pickaxes, women bringing food and water, children carrying stones. Even Clayton Hargrove appeared, having shed his suit coat, his sleeves rolled up, a shovel in his hands. Ethan stared at him. Hargrove met his eyes. I lost my wife in '85, he said quietly. My son in '86. Same fever as yours. He looked at the dam. I know what it's like to want to control everything because you couldn't control the one thing that mattered. He held out his hand. I was wrong. Ethan took it. They worked as one. The sound of shovels and pickaxes, of people calling to each other, of a community united by common purpose. The dam rose. The spillway took shape. The sun moved across the sky as the storm drew closer. 5 hours and the first drops fell, fat and heavy, striking the dry earth with small explosions of dust that smelled of rain and renewal. Then more. The drops came faster, thicker, until the air was filled with the sound of water hitting ground, hitting the dam, filling the basin inch by precious inch. People cheered. Some cried. Tom Hadley fell to his knees in prayer. Mrs. Henderson wept openly. The crowd began to disperse, families heading home in the rain, waving, calling out farewells and promises to return. Ethan and Claire remained standing at the edge of the dam as the water rose. 1 foot, 2 feet, 3. The spillway began to trickle, then to flow, carrying excess water away exactly as designed. "It's working," Claire said, her voice full of wonder. Ethan watched the rain fall, watched the basin fill, watched months of labor and sweat and despair transform into something real, something that would last. Claire turned to him, rain streaming down her face. "Ethan, I don't want to leave." He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not the mail-order bride that nobody wanted, but the woman who had stood beside him through everything, who had never wavered, never complained, never stopped believing. "Stay," he said. The word came out rough, urgent. Stay. Not as the housekeeper, not as anything you were before. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a silver ring, his mother's ring, the one Margaret had worn. "Stay as my wife." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. They stood together in the rain, foreheads touching, and for the first time in 3 years, Ethan felt something other than emptiness. He felt hope. He felt possibility. He felt alive. Tomorrow they would face whatever came next. Tomorrow there would be work and worry and the endless struggle of keeping a ranch alive in unforgiving country. But tonight, in the rain, with the dam holding and the water rising and Claire's hand in his, Ethan Cooper allowed himself to believe that broken things could heal, that second chances were real, and that love, when it came, was worth every risk. The rain fell through the night, steady and sure, filling the basin, filling the land, filling the empty places in two hearts that had thought they would never be full again. 2 years can change everything or nothing at all, depending on how you measure time. For some, 2 years is just 730 days, a number on a calendar, seasons turning in their ancient rhythm. For others, it's the space between one life and another, the distance from despair to hope, from emptiness to fullness. For Ethan Cooper, it was both. October 1889. The chapel bells of Red Creek rang out across the valley, their sound carrying on the autumn wind, clear and bright as new silver. The little white church at the edge of town had never held so many people, not even on Easter Sunday, when guilt and habit drove folks from their beds to the pews. Today they came for joy, for celebration, for the rare privilege of witnessing something good happen to someone who deserved it. Ethan stood at the altar, his hands clasped behind his back to hide their trembling. He wore a new suit, dark wool that Mrs. Henderson had ordered special from San Antonio, fitted properly this time, not like the funeral suit that had hung on him like a shroud. His boots were polished to a shine that would have made his drill sergeant proud. His hair was cut and combed, though one stubborn lock kept falling across his forehead, no matter how many times he pushed it back. Reverend Cross stood before him, Bible in hand, a smile creasing his weathered face. Behind Ethan, Tom Hadley served as his best man, standing straight and proud in clothes he'd borrowed for the occasion. The church was packed, every pew filled, people standing along the walls, children sitting cross-legged on the floor in front. And there in the front row sat Clayton Hargrove. The man who had tried to destroy him now sat with tears in his eyes, waiting to see him married. Life was strange that way, full of turns you could never predict, enemies becoming something else, something better. The organ began to play, the sound wheezing and imperfect, played by Sarah Mitchell, who had learned on this very instrument 60 years ago and still hit half the wrong keys, but nobody cared because the intention was pure. The door at the back of the church opened. Claire stood in the doorway, backlit by autumn sunshine that turned her hair to honey and gold. She wore a dress of cream-colored silk, simple and elegant, that Mrs. Henderson and the other women of Red Creek had spent 2 months sewing each stitch, an act of love for a woman who had arrived as an outsider and become one of their own. She carried wildflowers, purple asters, and golden coneflowers that grew along the creek that now ran year-round. Thanks to the dam, thanks to rain that had returned in the second year of their acquaintance like a benediction, like proof that sometimes prayers were answered after all. Claire walked down the aisle alone, her chin lifted, her eyes locked on Ethan's. No father to give her away, no family to stand witness, but she didn't need them. The whole town was her family now. Every person in this church a thread in the fabric of a life rebuilt from nothing. When she reached the altar, Ethan took her hand. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, across the calluses that matched his own. The evidence of 2 years of shared labor, shared struggle, shared hope. Dearly beloved, Reverend Cross began, and his voice was thick with emotion because he had baptized Ethan as an infant, had married him to Margaret all those years ago, had stood over the graves of his wife and son, and now got to witness this resurrection, this proof that life could begin again, even after the worst kind of ending. The ceremony was simple. Traditional words spoken in a country church, promises made in front of God and community, the exchange of rings, the declaration of husband and wife. When Cross told Ethan he could kiss his bride, the church erupted in applause and cheers, in the sound of people celebrating, not just a wedding but a victory, a testament to the stubborn refusal to give up even when giving up would have been easier. The kiss was brief, almost chaste, but when Ethan pulled back and looked into Claire's eyes, he saw his whole future there, and it was good. They walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, husband and wife, and the bells rang out again, joyful and insistent, announcing to the valley that love had won, that second chances were real, that broken hearts could mend if given enough time and the right person to mend them with. The reception was held in the churchyard under oak trees that were just beginning to turn gold and red. Tables had been set up laden with food that the women of Red Creek had been cooking for days. Fried chicken and potato salad, cornbread, and honey apple pies and berry cobblers, pitchers of cold tea and lemonade. Music played fiddles and guitars, the kind of music that made feet tepid, hearts light. Children ran and played, their laughter mixing with the adults' conversation, creating a symphony of community, of belonging. Ethan and Claire moved through the crowd accepting congratulations, hugs, handshakes, well wishes from people who had watched them build a life together, shovel by shovel, day by day, choosing each other again and again, even when it would have been easier to walk away. Tom Hadley embraced Ethan, pounded him on the back. "You did good, brother. Real good." "We did good," Ethan corrected, because the dam that had saved his ranch had saved Tom's too, and Marcus Webb's and 20 other families, and none of it would have been possible alone. Clayton Hargrove approached as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. He held a small package wrapped in brown paper tied with string. "Mr. and Mrs. Cooper," he said formally. "May I have a word?" They stepped aside, away from the crowd, under the shade of an oak, where the light filtered through leaves like stained glass. Hargrove held out the package. "This belonged to my son, William. He was 6 when he passed. The fever." He cleared his throat. "It's a wooden horse I carved for him. Never got to give it to him." Claire took the package, her eyes filling. "Mr. Hargrove, we can't possibly accept this. Please." His voice broke. "I want someone to have it. Someone who'll treasure it. Someone who'll tell their children about the bud was meant for." He looked at Ethan, and in his eyes was a pain that Ethan recognized, the pain of a father who had failed to save his child, who carried that failure like a stone in his chest every day. "My wife Elizabeth Hargrove continued quietly. She looked like you, Mrs. Cooper, same hair, same way of standing. When I saw you that first day at the dam, it was like seeing a ghost." He paused. "I hated you for it. Hated that Cooper had a second chance when I didn't." His hand shook slightly. "But I was wrong. We all deserve second chances. All of us." Hargrove extended his hand to Ethan. "Thank you for showing me that." They shook, and in that handshake was forgiveness, was understanding, was the recognition that grief makes people do terrible things, but redemption is always possible if you're willing to do the hard work of becoming better. As Hargrove walked away, Claire unwrapped the package. Inside was a wooden horse, beautifully carved, every detail. Perfect, the work of a father's love poured into wood in time. "We'll keep it safe," Claire whispered. "And when we have children, we'll tell them about William." Ethan pulled her close, kissed the top of her head. "I know we will." Spring 1890. The ranch had transformed. Where once there had been dust and dying cattle, now there was green grass and healthy animals. The dam held steady, its water feeding the land even through the dry months, a reservoir of hope that never ran empty. Ethan had built an addition onto the house, 2 new rooms and a larger porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset paint the sky. Claire had planted a garden, vegetables and flowers growing in neat rows, proof that the land could nurture life if given water and care and patience. The changes were not just physical. The ranch felt different, now felt alive in a way it hadn't since before the fever took Margaret and Thomas. There was laughter again. There was purpose. There was a future that stretched beyond mere survival. On a warm April morning, Claire sat in the rocking chair on the porch, her hands resting on her swollen belly. 6 months pregnant. The baby kicked and turned inside her, active and strong, and every movement was a small miracle, a promise kept. Ethan came around the corner of the house, his shirt dark with sweat from morning chores. When he saw Claire, he smiled, that slow smile that still made her heart skip, even after 2 years of marriage. He sat in the chair beside her, the chair that had once been Thomas's, the small rocking chair that had sat empty for so long. It creaked under his weight, not built for a grown man, but he didn't care. "How's our daughter?" he asked, placing his hand on Claire's belly. "Busy," Claire laughed. "She's got your restlessness, or your stubbornness." They sat in comfortable silence, rocking gently, watching the cattle graze in the distance, watching the windmill turn in the breeze, watching their life unfold in the simple beauty of an ordinary day. "Claire," Ethan said after a while, "I've been thinking. Dangerous habit." He smiled. "I want to name her Margaret, after my first wife." His voice was careful, uncertain. "If that's all right with you." Claire turned to look at him, her eyes soft. "Of course it's all right. She was part of you, part of your story. She made you who you are." She reached for his hand. "And maybe her middle name could be Elizabeth, after Mr. Hargrove's wife. To honor her too." Ethan's throat tightened. "Margaret Elizabeth Cooper." "It's perfect," Claire said. They sat like that for a long time. Two people who had found each other at the end of hope, who had built something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate sorrows, who understood that love doesn't erase the past but makes room for it, honors it, carries it forward into a future that holds both memory and new life. That evening, Ethan walked up the hill to the 2 graves that overlooked the valley. He went every Sunday, had gone every Sunday for 5 years. First in grief, then in remembrance, now in something that felt almost like peace. The graves were well tended, the wooden crosses he'd carved replaced now with proper headstones that Hargrove had paid for, an act of kindness that Ethan had tried to refuse until Claire pointed out that accepting help was sometimes the kindest thing you could do for the person offering it. Margaret Ann Cooper. The first stone read, "Beloved wife and mother, 1865 to 1884. Thomas Jacob Cooper, beloved son, 1880 to 1884. Ethan knelt between them, his hat in his hands. "I wanted you to know," he said quietly, "that Claire's expecting. A girl. We're going to name her after you, Margaret." He smiled. "She'll have your name and your strength. I'll make sure of that." He paused, looking out at the valley below, at the ranch that was thriving again, at the dam that glinted in the fading light. "And Thomas," he continued, his voice thick, "there's a boy in town, Danny Freeman. Lost his father last year. He comes around sometimes, helps with the horses. Reminds me of you. Full of questions. Full of life." He touched the small headstone. "I'm teaching him what I would have taught you. How to track. How to shoot. How to be a good man." The wind picked up, moving through the grass with a sound like breathing, like whispers of approval from voices he could no longer hear, but would never forget. "I miss you both," he said. "Every day. But I'm not drowning anymore. I'm living. Really living. And I hope that's what you'd want for me." Footsteps behind him. He turned to see Claire climbing the hill, moving slowly, one hand on her belly, the other holding her skirt up to keep it from catching on the tall grass. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. "Please." She sat beside him, a little awkward with the pregnancy, and together they looked at the graves of the family that was gone and thought about the family that was coming. "Do you talk to them?" Claire asked. "All the time." "What do you say?" "That I'm grateful. That I'm sorry. That I hope they're proud of who I'm becoming." Claire took his hand. "They are. I'm sure of it." As the sun set and the sky turned purple and gold, Ethan and Claire made their way back down the hill, back to the house that was no longer a tomb, but a home, back to a life that held both sorrow and joy. Memory and hope, the past and the future woven together like threads in a tapestry, too complex and beautiful to ever fully understand. September 1890. Labor came in the middle of the night as it so often does, with no regard for convenience or preparation. Claire's water broke at 2 in the morning, soaking through the sheets, and Ethan woke to her hand gripping his arm, her voice tight with pain. It's time. He was up and moving before his brain fully engaged, pulling on clothes, lighting lamps, his hands shaking so badly he could barely strike the match. He'd helped birth calves, and foals had seen the process of new life entering the world dozens of times. But this was different. This was Claire. This was his child. I'll get the doctor, he said. No time. Claire's face was pale but determined. Send for Mrs. Henderson. She's delivered half the babies in this county. Ethan ran. Through the dark, across the fields, his boots pounding on the hard earth, his lungs burning. He reached the Henderson place and pounded on the door until old Mrs. Vaughn was. Henderson appeared in her nightgown, her white hair in a braid down her back. It's Claire, he gasped. The baby's coming. Mrs. Henderson moved with surprising speed for a woman of 78 gathering her bag of supplies, calling for her granddaughter to help, barking orders at Ethan to boil water and fetch clean towels, and then get out of the way and let the women work. By the time they returned to the house, Claire's contractions were coming hard and fast. Mrs. Henderson took one look at her and nodded. This one's in a hurry. The next hours were the longest of Ethan's life. He paced the porch, wearing a groove in the boards, listening to Claire's cries through the window, feeling more helpless than he'd ever felt, even in combat, even in the worst days of the drought, because there was nothing he could do. No action he could take to ease her pain or speed the process. Tom Hadley arrived at dawn, having heard the news from a ranch hand who'd been riding past. He sat with Ethan on the porch steps, said nothing, just offered the comfort of presence of friendship that required no words. The sun was fully up when the crying started. Not Claire's cries, but a different sound, higher, more insistent. The sound of new life announcing its arrival. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her face tired but smiling. You have a daughter, Mr. Cooper. Healthy and strong, just like her mama. Ethan stumbled inside, his legs weak, his heart hammering. Claire lay in the bed exhausted and soaked with sweat, her hair plastered to her forehead. But she was smiling, and in her arms, wrapped in a clean white blanket, was the smallest, most perfect thing Ethan had ever seen. Margaret Elizabeth Cooper, 6 pounds, 2 ounces. Born September 15th, 1890, at 7:32 in the morning. She had a shock of dark hair, her mother's chin and lungs that worked perfectly, as evidenced by the lusty crying that filled the room. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, afraid to touch, afraid his calloused hands would damage something so delicate. She won't break, Claire said softly. Hold your daughter. He took her this tiny bundle of warmth and weight, and felt something inside him shift and settle like a bone sliding back into place after years of being dislocated. She was real. She was his. She was the future made flesh. Hello, Margaret, he whispered. Welcome home. The baby opened her eyes, unfocused and dark, and looked at him like she knew him, like she'd been waiting for this moment, like she understood on some level deeper than words that this man would protect her, would love her, would teach her everything he knew about surviving in a hard world with a soft heart. Thank you, he said to Claire, for this, for her, for everything. Claire reached up and touched his face. We made something good, Ethan, something that will last. 2 years later, summer 1892. The ranch was prosperous now. The dam had proven its worth through 2 dry spells, keeping water available when neighboring ranches went thirsty. Ethan had paid off his debts and begun expanding his herd. He'd hired Danny Freeman full-time, teaching the boy the ranching trade, giving him the mentorship his own father had provided before death took him. The house had grown again. Another room for the second child, Thomas William Cooper, born in March of 1891, named for the son Ethan had lost and the son Hargrove had lost, carrying both legacies forward. Margaret toddled around the porch at 2 years old, chasing chickens and laughing at everything fearless and joyful in the way children are when they're raised in love and safety. Thomas, just over a year, crawled behind her, trying to keep up with his sister, determined not to be left behind. Claire was pregnant again, just 4 months along, and Ethan had built her a rocking chair on the porch where she could rest in the afternoons while the children napped. She sat there now, her hands on her growing belly, watching Ethan work with Danny to repair a section of fence that had come down in the last storm. Life was good, not perfect. There were still hard days, still struggles, still moments when Ethan woke in the night reaching for people who weren't there anymore. But the hard days were balanced now by good ones, by laughter and purpose, and the knowledge that he was building something that would outlast him, a legacy of perseverance and love, and the stubborn refusal to let tragedy have the final word. Clayton Hargrove visited, often had become something like family, an honorary grandfather to the children who would never know their blood grandfather. He'd sold half his land, distributed the money to the families he'd wronged over the years, kept only what he needed to live comfortably. The rest of his time, he spent building things, a new school for Red Creek, a community center, a library stocked with books ordered from back east. Redemptions, Ethan had learned, was not a moment, but a process, not a destination, but a journey that lasted as long as you drew breath. One evening in late August, after the children were asleep and the chores were done, Ethan and Claire sat on the porch in their matching rocking chairs, watching the sun set over land that had nearly killed them, but had instead made them stronger. "Do you ever think about that day at the train station?" Claire asked. "When you found me sitting there all the time. Do you regret it?" "Bringing me here," Ethan reached over and took her hand. "It was the best decision I ever made, second only to asking you to stay." "I would have stayed anyway," she admitted. "Even if you hadn't asked, I'd already decided I wasn't leaving." He smiled. "Stubborn woman. You knew that when you married me." They sat in comfortable silence, rocking gently, listening to the sounds of evening. Crickets beginning their song, cattle settling for the night, the windmill creaking in the breeze. Ethan, Claire said after a while, "Promise me something, anything. When we're old and gray, when the children have children of their own, promise you'll tell them this story about how we met, about the drought and the dam in the town that chose hope over fear." He looked at her, at the woman who had arrived with nothing and given him everything, at the wife and mother and partner who had stood beside him through every trial. "I promise," he said, "and I'll tell them the truth, that I was a broken man who thought his life was over, and that you showed me it was just beginning." Claire leaned her head on his shoulder. "We saved each other, Ethan." "Yes," he agreed, "we did." As the stars began to appear, one by one in the darkening sky as the night settled soft and cool over the valley, Ethan thought about the journey that had brought him here. From despair to hope, from isolation to community, from death to life. The dam still stood solid and sure, a monument not just to human ingenuity, but to human resilience, to the stubborn belief that tomorrow could be better than today, if you were willing to work for it, to fight for it, to build it with your own two hands, in the help of people who cared enough to stand beside you. In the distance, he could just make out the two graves on the hillside marking the people he had loved and lost. But he no longer looked at them with the crushing weight of guilt and sorrow. He looked at them with gratitude for the time they'd had together, with the knowledge that love doesn't end when people die, it just changes form, becomes part of who you are, and informs every choice you make, every kindness you show, every second chance you're brave enough to take. Margaret and Thomas were not forgotten. They never would be. But they were no longer anchors holding him in the past. They were stars guiding him forward, reminding him that life was precious, that love was worth the risk of loss, that the only way to honor the dead was to live fully, to love deeply, to build something that mattered. The future stretched before him, uncertain and challenging, as it always had been. There would be more droughts, more struggles, more moments of doubt and fear. But there would also be laughter and growth and the daily miracles of children becoming themselves, of love, deepening with time, of a community built on mutual support rather than individual survival. Ethan Cooper had learned the hardest lesson of all, that the strongest structures are not built of earth and stone, but of trust and sacrifice and the willingness to stand together when standing alone would be easier. That water could save a ranch, but people saved each other. That second chances were rare and precious and should never be wasted. As he sat there with Claire's hand in his, with his children sleeping safely inside, with the dam holding steady in the darkness, Ethan allowed himself something he hadn't felt in years: contentment. Not happiness exactly, because happiness was too simple a word for the complex mix of joy and sorrow, memory and hope, loss and gain that made up a human life. But contentment. The deep satisfaction of knowing he had done his best, had chosen love over bitterness, had built something lasting from the ashes of his grief. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and unchanging, bearing witness to one man's journey from darkness to light, from brokenness to wholeness, from the loneliness of loss to the fullness of family. And in a small house on a Texas ranch in the year of our Lord, 1892, Ethan Cooper closed his eyes and offered up a prayer of thanksgiving for mail-order brides that nobody wanted, for droughts that forced men to work together, for rain that came just in time, and for the stubborn human capacity to heal, to hope, to begin again, even when all seemed lost. The dam would stand for generations, long after Ethan and Claire were gone, a testament to what ordinary people could accomplish when they refused to give up, when they chose community over isolation, when they believed that the future was worth fighting for. But the real legacy was not made of earth and water. It was made of the children who would grow up hearing the story of how their parents met, of how love could grow in the harshest soil if given enough care and time. It was made of the town that learned to work together instead of competing for scraps. It was made of a former enemy who found redemption in generosity, of a boy who found a father figure in a broken man, of a woman who found dignity in a place she never meant to stay. This was the true story of the West, not of gunslingers and gold rushes, but of ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply because they refused to accept that suffering was inevitable, that loss was permanent, that broken things could never be repaired. The West was built by people like Ethan Cooper and Claire Hartford, by people who showed up when they were needed, who kept their promises, who understood that survival was not enough, that life required more than breathing, required purpose and connection and the daily choice to care about something beyond yourself. As the night deepened and the moon rose full and bright, casting silver light across the sleeping land, Ethan Cooper held his wife's hand and thought about the journey that had brought him here and the journey that still lay ahead, and found both worth taking. Because in the end, that's all any of us can hope for: to find our people, to build our dam, to stand against the drought and believe that rain will come, that morning will break, that second chances are real, and to pass that belief on to the next generation so they too will know that brokenness is not the end of the story. It's just the beginning. 135 years later, the dam still stands. Modern engineers have reinforced it, added spillways and controls that Ethan Cooper never dreamed of, but the basic structure remains the earth and stone packed by hands that believed in something worth building. A historical marker stands beside it, now weathered bronze on a granite base, telling the story in abbreviated form. Cooper's Dam, built 1887, saved the Red Creek Valley during the Great Drought. Community effort led by Ethan Cooper and his wife Claire. What the marker doesn't say, what no historical marker could ever convey, is the full truth of what happened here. How a cavalry scout and a mail-order bride found each other at the end of hope. How a community chose to stand together when division would have been easier. How enemies became friends. How grief transformed into purpose. How love grew in soil that seemed too barren to sustain anything at all. But the stories persist, passed down through generations, embellished and refined with each telling, until they take on the quality of myth, of legend, of the kind of tale our grandparents might share on a porch swing at dusk, when the world grows quiet and memory becomes more real than the present. And perhaps that's how it should be. Perhaps the specific details matter less than the fundamental truth at the heart of it all, that we are not defined by our worst moments, but by what we choose to do after them. That community is stronger than isolation. That water can save a ranch, but people save each other. That second chances are possible if we're brave enough to take them. The dam still stands. The water still flows. And somewhere in the infinite complexity of human experience, two souls who found each other when they were most lost continue their journey, not in body, but in legacy, in the lives they touched, in the example they set, in the stubborn insistence that tomorrow can be better than today if we're willing to work for it. This is the story of Ethan Cooper and Claire Hartford. This is the story of the last cowboy stand. This is the story of how the West was really won, not with guns and gold, but with shovels and sweat, in the unshakable belief that broken things can heal, that love can grow in the driest soil, that rain will come. Always, the rain will come.